So the twin economic crises of inflation and this supply chain crunch show little signs of abating tonight, with the adverse impact being felt by Americans everywhere from the grocery store to your gas pump. So let's bring in tonight's Bream Team panel for some money talk. FreedomWorks economist Steve Moore and Taxpayers Protection Alliance Policy VP Patrick Hedger. Great to have both of you with us tonight.
Hi, Shannon.
Okay, so the New York Times writing in a piece this weekend says people actually are doing well, but it's their worry about inflation that's making them think they're not doing well. Here is what they say. It says the headline, Americans are flush with cash and jobs. They also think the economy is awful. They say the reasons seem to be tied to the psychology of inflation and the ways people assess their economic well-being. It may well be shaped by the psychological scars of the pandemic, one manifestation of this being an era of exhaustion. So, Steve, they say people are actually in a pretty good financial situation. They just don't realize it because they're scared of the prices that are going up and not really seeing a solution to that.
Well, I disagree with this idea that somehow this is psychological. It's something that people see every single day, Shannon, whether you go to the grocery store, whether you go see your travel agent, whether you go to the gas pump. Everybody is feeling this inflation. So it's not something that's made up. It's not transitory. It's getting worse. And the problem for Joe Biden is that he was saying, well, gee, wages are up, so why are people feeling so uncomfortable? And the answer to that is, yeah, wages are up by 4%, but Shannon, prices are up by 6.2%. So the math is simple here, that if your cost of living goes up by 6.2%, your paycheck is shrinking. And so I think incidentally, I'm old enough to remember when Ronald Reagan ran against Jimmy Carter for president in 1980, the last time we had this kind of inflation. Mm-hmm. And Jimmy Carter lost in a landslide election to Ronald Reagan, the challenger. And inflation was the major factor, Shannon, because people felt it every single day.
Yeah, the late 1970s, the malaise, the lines at the gas pumps. I mean, there was a lot working against Jimmy Carter and his attempts to save and be reelected to another term, the legacy of his presidency. So let's talk about this. Senator Joe Manchin is kind of the guy that's at the center of everything happening in Washington right now. They've still got this Build Back Better plan that they've got to get done. It's going to be a heavy lift. The the Wall Street Journal editorial board has this piece tonight. The headline is Inflation and Building Back Worse. The sub says Joe Manchin has ample reason to kill spending that is harming workers. We saw Senator Manchin tweet about this. We know that he gets it, this issue of inflation and how people are perceiving it. The article says this inflation surge is all the evidence Senator Joe Manchin needs to stop his party from building back worse. The West Virginian warned months ago about spending and inflation, and he's been proven right. They go on to say Congress ignores inflation because it doesn't want to admit that its policies are the leading cause, kill the bill, and rescue the American middle class. Patrick, will that argument persuade Joe Manchin, who already seems to be sort of on this path?
Yeah, it ought to, Shannon. You know, just to back up Steve a little bit, there are definite problems in the economy. There are definite constraints in the supply chain that are creating inflationary pressures. But there is a psychological component to inflation when you have the government pursuing policies of big spending, big borrowing, and big printing. People begin to expect those things to contribute to inflation, and then they begin to adjust their behavior accordingly. So it's only logical to assume that business owners and entrepreneurs are raising their prices in anticipation of inflation because of the policies being pursued by Washington. If I was the Biden administration, I'd be ditching the big taxing, big spending plans and be looking at how we can alleviate constraints in the supply chain right away.
I want to play something from the White House Chief of Staff, Ron Klain. He says they are working on it.
I have no beef with voters, pardon the pun, who say, look, the recovery is making progress, but not far enough along for me yet. That's why we aren't stopping work now. That's why we're working hard to move the recovery forward.
So, Steve, you give them some credit for acknowledging, like, listen, these numbers are not great. He says they've still got work to do, or no?
Well, you know, this recovery, we are in a recovery, no question about it. The economy is performing a lot better as we come out of the COVID crisis. But, you know, the recovery began over a year ago, Shannon, and we had very strong growth in the last months of Donald Trump's presidency, and yet we didn't see this kind of inflation problem. I think the inflation problem has really been fueled by these massive spending bills that Biden has passed. Remember, we had the $2 trillion spending bill at the beginning of the year when we already had $1 trillion left over from the COVID relief fund. Now they've got another $1 trillion so-called infrastructure bill. And they want to now pass another $4 trillion spending bill. If I were in Congress right now and I would, or advising President Biden, I advised Donald Trump on the economy, I'd say, ditch this plan. The last thing the economy needs right now is massive increases in spending and borrowing. And by the way, how is that borrowing financed? By printing money. You don't have to be a PhD in economics to know the more money you print, the more inflation you get.
I want to put up an example of the prices rising: meat, fish, and eggs, beef, and electricity. And while that's up, Patrick, give you a final word on where you see this thing going.
Yeah, I mean, if the Biden administration continues to pursue this policy of the Build Back Better agenda, you're going to see business owners price that in, and you're going to continue to see inflation because people are expecting it. They've already seen it. They're expecting more of it to come. And until you do something about the supply chain issues, until you do something in looking at the COVID-19 restrictions that are still in place that may be constraining the supply chain but are no longer necessary, you're going to continue to have this problem. And again, this is real inflation. Up until now, we were seeing narrow categories like used cars and fuel contributing most to inflation. We are now seeing widespread price increases. This is a real problem. It's not apocalyptic yet, but if we don't do something now to alleviate the supply chains, we're really going to regret it.
All right, Patrick and Steve, thank you both.
Thanks, Shannon.